Do you remember the meals that were never written in glossy cookbooks but kept families alive in the harshest times? On plantations, enslaved people turned scraps, wild plants, and meager rations into dishes that carried both nourishment and memory. These were not just recipes, they were acts of resilience, born from necessity and shaped by centuries of tradition. Today, we're uncovering 30 survival foods of slaves on plantations, the humble beginnings of what would become the backbone of Southern cuisine: ash cakes. Picture this: you're standing in a field. After hours of back-breaking work, stomach grumbling, and the only thing between you and hunger is a bag of coarse cornmeal. No skillet, no stove, no fancy gadgets from Williams-Sonoma. What do you do? If you were enslaved on a plantation, the answer was simple, if not exactly glamorous. You made ash cakes.
A fire cake or ash cake, a very, very simple.
These were humble little patties of cornmeal dough tucked right into the hot ashes of a fire. Yes, ashes. The outside would char, the inside would steam, and see if you brushed off the soot carefully, you'd find yourself with something warm, filling, and surprisingly decent. Think of it as the original stone oven bread, except the oven was literally the earth itself. The origins of ash cakes go back to both Native American practices and African traditions, where corn and grain were cooked without the benefit of iron pots or ovens. For the enslaved, this wasn't just about preference. It was survival. Rations were minimal: cornmeal, maybe some molasses, perhaps a scrap of pork if luck tilted your way. Ash cakes turned that meager cornmeal into something that could be eaten on the go, filling bellies during endless days in the fields. There's something almost poetic in their simplicity. Families would gather around a fire, share these blackened, smoky cakes, and in those quiet moments, food became more than sustenance. It became a way to hold on. Ash cakes carried with them resilience, resourcefulness, and a reminder that flavor doesn't always come from spice racks, but from endurance. Today, ash cakes might strike us as primitive, until you realize people pay extra for wood-fired artisan flatbreads at hip restaurants. Funny how survival food of the past often becomes the gourmet trend of the future. Would you still call it primitive if it showed up on a $14 appetizer menu? Hoe cakes. If ash cakes were the bare-bones survival bread, then hoe cakes were their slightly more glamorous cousin, the Beyoncé to ash cakes, Destiny's Child, if you will. Born out of necessity on plantations,
and make a childhood favorite of mine, hoe cakes.
Hoe cakes were made from the same modest base of cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt. But instead of burying them in ashes, enslaved people would spread the batter onto the flat blade of a hoe and cook it over an open fire. Yes, the same hoe used in the fields all day to chop weeds became, after hours, a makeshift frying pan. Talk about multitasking. The method itself speaks volumes about resilience. When enslaved cooks lacked iron skillets or were forbidden from using certain tools, they repurposed what was available. The hoe's metal surface, heated in the flames, gave the cakes a crisp bottom and soft interior, not unlike today's griddle cakes. In fact, George Washington himself was said to be fond of hoe cakes, swimming in honey or butter. Though, let's be clear, his plate looked a lot different from what was eaten in the quarters. For the enslaved, these cornmeal cakes weren't a leisurely breakfast treat. They were quick fuel, eaten on the go, sustaining bodies worked to exhaustion. Still, despite the hardship, hoe cakes carried a kind of dignity. They connected African culinary traditions with the New World's staple crop, corn, creating a food that was both practical and cultural. Families would gather around fires, share hoe cakes, and find in their smoky sweetness a small comfort, a taste of belonging. Fast forward to today, and hoe cakes have been claimed as part of Southern heritage cuisine. You'll see them dressed up in cast iron skillets with maple syrup, bacon, or even artisanal jams. It's a long road from plantation survival food to brunch menu star, but the essence remains simple, sturdy, and unforgettable. Wouldn't it be something if every bite carried the memory of where they came from? Rice and peas. At first glance, rice and peas sounds like the kind of dish you'd order at a cozy Caribbean restaurant, maybe with reggae playing softly in the background. But for enslaved people on southern plantations, rice and peas was not a matter of leisure dining, it was a matter of survival, memory, and sheer ingenuity. Despite the deceptively simple name peas, usually meant cowpeas or black-eyed peas, legumes that were hearty, filling, and packed with protein. Combined with rice, they made a complete meal, one that echoed directly back to West Africa, where similar pairings were, and still are, central to daily life. Rice itself was more than just food, it was a skill. Enslaved Africans brought with them generations of knowledge about cultivating rice, knowledge that was exploited to build the rice economies of South Carolina and Georgia. Imagine the irony. The very people forced to labor in brutal conditions, ankle-deep in mosquito-infested paddies, were the ones who knew best how to grow the crop that sustained everyone else. Yet from that same crop, they carved out small meals of comfort for themselves, transforming rations into something familiar and nourishing. Preparation was straightforward. Boil rice until tender, stir in cooked peas, season with whatever was at hand. Salt pork if available, maybe onions, maybe just a dash of salt. The result was hearty, filling, and easily stretched to feed many mouths. In a world designed to starve them, rice and peas offered energy, strength, and the faint taste of home. Today, the dish has evolved into countless regional variations. From Jamaican rice and peas made with coconut milk to Hoppin' John, a Southern New Year's staple. What was once food of survival is now food of celebration. Funny, isn't it, how the meals born of hardship often end up defining the culture's soul? Okra stew. There's something almost magical about okra, that long green pod with a texture people either love or loathe. But for enslaved Africans on plantations,
a delicious, slimy or drawy okra stew recipe.
Okra wasn't just another vegetable. It was a living connection to home. Carried across the Atlantic in the memories and sometimes even the pockets of enslaved people, okra became one of the most enduring crops of the African diaspora. Out of necessity, it found its way into stews, simmered slowly with whatever ingredients were available, stretching scraps into something nourishing and deeply familiar. Okra stew was never fancy. At its core, it might include a few handfuls of okra, some field peas or beans, perhaps bits of salted pork or fish if fortune allowed, all stewed down with onions or wild herbs. The star, though, was okra's natural thickening power, what cooks today politely call mucilage. That slick, gluey texture turned watery broths into hearty, filling stews. In a time when rations were sparse, this was no small feat. It meant that little bowls could feed big families, and every spoonful carried both calories and comfort. Beyond its practicality, okra stew held emotional weight. It echoed the dishes of West Africa, like gumbo and soups thickened with okra, that enslaved people once ate in freedom. Around the fire, bowls of stew became more than just food. They were anchors of memory, a way to preserve culture under conditions designed to erase it. Today, okra stew lives on in countless variations: Louisiana gumbo, Nigerian okra soup, Caribbean callaloo. It's the kind of dish that sneaks into modern kitchens without people realizing the centuries of survival behind it. So the next time you wrinkle your nose at okra's slime, remember, what you call strange, generations before called salvation. Isn't it funny how survival foods so often become soul foods? Molasses porridge. If ash cakes and hoe cakes were the sturdy breads of survival, then molasses porridge was the quiet comfort food of the enslaved. Imagine a pot of cornmeal or hominy bubbling slowly over a fire, transformed into something soft, warm, and soothing, with just a drizzle of molasses stirred in. It wasn't extravagant, far from it, but in a world of scarcity, that sweetness made all the difference. For children in particular, this porridge was often the first taste of something resembling dessert, a rare indulgence in lives otherwise marked by hunger. The base was humble: cornmeal mixed with water, cooked down into a mush that could be eaten thick with a spoon or thinned into a gruel. On its own, it was plain, almost bleak. But molasses changed everything. Cheap and widely available on plantations, molasses was a byproduct of the sugar trade, an industry built, of course, on the same enslaved labor that made it accessible. That dark, sticky syrup carried more than just calories. It brought iron and minerals, a small nutritional boost that could mean the difference between strength and exhaustion. Molasses porridge wasn't just about feeding the body, though. It fed the spirit. For enslaved families, it created a moment of comfort, a sense of sweetness in otherwise bitter lives. Parents could ladle it out to children and, just for a moment, offer them something that felt like care, like love. Food as survival, yes, but also food as tenderness. Today, you might find something similar in the nostalgia of cream of wheat or oatmeal with brown sugar. Breakfast bowls topped with maple syrup or honey get all the glory on Instagram. Yet molasses porridge was doing sweet and hearty long before brunch culture claimed it. Isn't it striking how even the simplest bowl can hold centuries of struggle and resilience? Collard greens and pot liquor. Collard greens are more than just a side dish. They are a story simmered low and slow in a pot. For enslaved people on plantations,
I'm going to show you how to make the best collard greens you ever had.
collard greens represented both sustenance and resilience. The tough, leafy greens, cheap, abundant, and often dismissed by the wealthy, were boiled down until tender, usually with bits of salt pork or ham hock if such scraps were available. The long simmering didn't just soften the leaves, it transformed them into something deeply flavorful, hearty, and nourishing. But the real secret treasure wasn't only in the greens themselves, it was in the pot liquor, the dark, savory broth left behind after cooking. Rich with vitamins and minerals, pot liquor was liquid survival, often sipped on its own or poured over cornbread to stretch the meal. In a time when every calorie mattered and nothing could be wasted, enslaved families understood the value of this broth long before modern nutritionists started touting the benefits of kale smoothies and bone broth. Beyond its practicality, collard greens and their liquor carried a sense of community. A pot of greens could feed many mouths, and gathering around to share it became a ritual of togetherness in lives otherwise marked by harsh isolation. The flavor, the mix of smoky, salty, and earthy, was a reminder that even in oppression, creativity could coax comfort from the simplest ingredients. Today, collard greens are a Southern classic, served at Sunday dinners, barbecues, and holiday tables. Pot liquor has even been celebrated by chefs as a culinary gem, no longer dismissed as mere byproduct. What once signaled survival now symbolizes heritage, pride, and continuity. It's funny, really, while trendy cafes serve wellness broths in mason jars, the enslaved were sipping their own form of liquid gold centuries ago. Who really started the health craze first? Salt pork and cornmeal mush. Few meals capture the stark reality of plantation life quite like salt pork and cornmeal mush. It was not a dish of luxury or variety, but one of necessity, pieced together from what little was available to enslaved people. Cornmeal, the most common ration, could be boiled into a thick mush, something filling enough to keep hunger at bay, but bland to the point of monotony. Salt pork, when it appeared, was rarely a generous cut. More often, it was a scrap of fat, a rind, or a bony piece that others had discarded. Yet, when boiled together, the fat from the pork seeped into the mush, lending richness, salt, and just enough flavor to turn survival food into something almost satisfying. The brilliance of this dish lay in its frugality. Cornmeal was cheap, shelf-stable, and versatile, able to stretch into large portions. Salt pork, though meager, provided essential fat and protein. Combined, they created a meal that could sustain someone through long hours in the fields. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't balanced by modern standards, but it kept bodies moving in a world that demanded backbreaking labor without mercy. Beyond its calories, though, salt pork and cornmeal mush carried deeper meaning. To enslaved families, it was often the taste of daily life, the reliable constant in an uncertain world. Children grew up on it, elders leaned on it, and everyone understood it as a reminder of both scarcity and endurance. Today, you'll find echoes of this dish in polenta topped with bacon, or grits served with a pat of butter and pork cracklings. Dressed up, it graces restaurant menus as comfort food, a far cry from the hardscrabble origins. It's a humbling thought. What was once bare-bones survival is now sold as rustic charm. Would those who first ate it out of necessity ever imagine it becoming fashionable? Sweet potatoes. Long before they became the darling of health bloggers and Thanksgiving tables.
This is a sweet potato. Actually, all of these are sweet potatoes.
Sweet potatoes were the steadfast companions of survival on plantations. Unlike delicate crops that demanded care and spoiled quickly, sweet potatoes were hardy, forgiving, and endlessly versatile. They thrived in poor soil, resisted rot, and could be stored through lean months, which made them a lifeline for enslaved people who were often denied reliable access to food. Whether roasted in ashes, boiled in water, or mashed into a humble meal, sweet potatoes delivered warmth, calories, and comfort. There was a quiet genius in how they were used. A single sweet potato could serve as a meal on its own, its natural sweetness offering a rare touch of indulgence in a life structured by deprivation. Roasted whole in fire pits, their skins blackened and insides caramelized, they were portable and filling, the closest thing to a pocket-sized energy bar of the 19th century. For children, they were often the first solid food, soft enough for small mouths and nourishing enough to sustain growth. For adults, they were fuel for the body and, in many ways, a balm for the spirit. Sweet potatoes also carried memory. They linked the enslaved back to African food traditions, where yams held a similar role as staple and symbol. In the New World, the sweet potato became both substitute and successor, a bridge between continents and cultures. Around the fire, peeling back a charred skin to reveal that golden flesh was more than eating. It was remembering. Today, sweet potatoes enjoy celebrity status, showing up in fries, lattes, and Instagram-worthy bowls. Yet beneath the modern hype lies the truth. For enslaved people, sweet potatoes were not a trend, but a necessity, proof that even the humblest root can sustain both body and heritage. Black-eyed peas. Black-eyed peas may look unassuming, but for enslaved people on plantations, they were tiny powerhouses of survival and memory. These legumes, with their signature dark eye, had deep roots in West African food traditions.
This is a simple black-eyed pea recipe,
where beans and peas were daily staples. Brought across the Atlantic, they became a crucial crop in the American South, valued for their hardiness and ability to thrive in poor soil where other foods faltered. For the enslaved, black-eyed peas were not just another ration. They were a link to home and a lifeline on hostile ground. Cooked simply, they were often boiled into stews with little more than salt, perhaps flavored with scraps of pork or garden greens if such luxuries could be found. Despite their modest preparation, black-eyed peas provided vital protein, fiber, and energy, helping bodies endure endless labor. A pot of peas, stretched with cornmeal or rice, could feed a family and keep hunger at bay. Yet beyond the calories, these beans carried cultural significance. They were a familiar taste in an unfamiliar, brutal world, a reminder of the dish's ancestors once prepared with freedom and intention. Over time, black-eyed peas took on symbolic meaning as well. By the 19th century, they were associated with luck and resilience, traditions that continue today in dishes like Hoppin' John, eaten on New Year's Day for prosperity. It's remarkable to think that what began as survival food in the quarters became a celebrated part of Southern culinary identity. In the present, black-eyed peas appear on soul food menus and in vegan cookbooks alike, praised for their health benefits and versatility. But behind every spoonful lies history. What many see now as comfort food was once a meal of endurance, a testament to resourcefulness under oppression. Isn't it striking how humble beans can carry the weight of survival and hope? Catfish, river catches. When rations ran short and plantation scraps weren't enough, the rivers and creeks became both pantry and promise for the enslaved. Catfish, with its whiskered face and bottom-dwelling habits, was often the catch of choice. It wasn't glamorous, but it was plentiful, resilient, and willing to take bait from even the simplest traps. For enslaved families, casting a line into muddy water or setting up makeshift fish traps wasn't just a pastime. It was survival. The rivers provided what the ration books denied, and catfish turned long nights of hunger into meals that could carry a body through back-breaking labor. Cooking catfish was as varied as the circumstances allowed. Sometimes it was fried over an open fire in a bit of lard, the crackle of hot oil a rare sound of indulgence. Other times, it was boiled into stews with whatever greens, onions, or peppers could be foraged. Even when cooked plain over coals, the fish's rich, meaty flesh was filling and satisfying. The bones were picked clean, nothing wasted. For children, the sight of a wriggling catch pulled from a line meant excitement, the closest thing to a feast in an environment designed to starve. Beyond nutrition, there was also meaning in catching fish. Fishing echoed traditions from Africa, where rivers and coasts had long provided sustenance. Gathering by the water to set traps or pull in nets became a way of remembering, of holding on to skills passed down across oceans. The catfish, slippery and stubborn, symbolized resilience in its own right. Today, catfish is a Southern staple, fried golden at fish fries, or served with hush puppies in diners. But its history is far older and heavier. For the enslaved, it was not about leisure or indulgence. It was survival pulled straight from the water, proof that even muddy rivers could yield hope. Hominy, lye-treated corn. Hominy is one of those foods that hides a story bigger than itself. At first glance, it's just corn that looks a little puffier, softer, maybe even unremarkable. But for enslaved people on plantations, hominy represented both survival and ingenuity. Ordinary cornmeal, while filling, was not enough to sustain life on its own. Without a process called nixtamalization, soaking and cooking corn in lye or wood ash water, the body could not unlock the vital nutrients within. Enslaved Africans, drawing on knowledge carried from both African and indigenous traditions, knew how to make corn truly nourishing. By treating kernels with alkali, they created hominy, a food that delivered not just calories but crucial vitamins like niacin, warding off malnutrition diseases such as pellagra. The preparation was laborious but necessary. Corn was shelled, dried, and boiled with lye until the husks loosened and the kernels swelled into pearly puffs. These could then be eaten plain, ground again into grits, or simmered into soups and stews. Hominy was versatile. It could stretch a pot of beans, bulk up a meatless dish, or simply be seasoned with salt or fat to make a filling meal. In a system designed to break bodies through hunger and toil, this process was a quiet act of resistance, ensuring health and survival through knowledge that the oppressors often overlooked. There was also something deeply connective about hominy. It echoed indigenous traditions of the Americas, while intertwining with African foodways, creating a dish that belonged to no single culture, but carried the fingerprints of both. Around fires in the quarters, bowls of hominy fed families, sustained children, and offered a rare sense of continuity. Today, hominy lives on in Southern grits, Mexican pozole, and countless regional recipes. What was once survival science has become comfort food, proof that resilience can transform necessity into tradition. Field peas and greens stew. Field peas and greens stew was never meant to impress a guest or sit on a banquet table. It was, at its heart, food for survival, humble, hearty, and endlessly adaptable. Field peas, not to be confused with the sweet green peas we toss into modern salads, were sturdy legumes that thrived in poor soil and scorching heat. They grew in abundance where little else would, making them a dependable staple for enslaved people who had to stretch whatever they could grow or glean. Paired with wild or garden-grown greens, collards, turnips, or even foraged dandelion leaves, the peas transformed into a one-pot meal that was filling, nutritious, and remarkably resourceful. Preparation was straightforward but ingenious. A pot set over an open fire would be filled with water, handfuls of dried peas, and chopped greens. If luck offered scraps of pork or fat, they'd be tossed in for depth of flavor. If not, salt and onions might suffice. The peas softened, the greens melted into the broth, and together they created a stew that could be ladled out to many, stretching rations into sustenance. The broth was as valuable as the solids, rich with minerals and flavor, often sopped up with cornbread or simply drunk from the bowl. Beyond nourishment, this stew carried meaning. It mirrored dishes in West Africa, where beans and leafy greens had long been central to daily cooking. In this way, enslaved people wove memory into their meals, keeping alive traditions that tied them back to home. Around the pot, families could share not just food, but continuity. Today, chefs celebrate field peas as heirloom ingredients and greens as superfoods. Yet for the enslaved, this was not a wellness trend. It was survival simmered slowly in a pot, a reminder that resilience often tastes earthy, smoky, and deeply human. Chitterlings, pig intestines. Chitterlings, often shortened to chitlins, are one of those foods that spark strong opinions even today. To some, they're a delicacy that carries the weight of tradition. To others, they're a reminder of poverty and struggle. But for enslaved people on plantations, chitterlings weren't about choice or taste. They were what was left after the enslavers took the prized cuts of pork for themselves. The intestines, along with feet, ears, and other discarded parts, were handed down as scraps. From necessity, the enslaved transformed these unwanted pieces into meals that could feed families, making dignity out of denial. Preparing chitterlings was not a quick or easy task. They had to be cleaned meticulously, scraped, rinsed, and boiled, sometimes for hours, to remove impurities and soften their tough texture. The smell was pungent, the labor exhausting, but the result was food. And that mattered more than anything. Seasoned with onions, garlic, or peppers if available, chitterlings could be simmered into stews or fried into crisp bites. They weren't glamorous, but they were filling, and they turned what was meant as waste into sustenance. Yet beyond survival, chitlins became something larger. Cooking them carried echoes of West African traditions of nose-to-tail eating, where no part of the animal was discarded. In the quarters, sharing a pot of chitterlings became an act of community, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, people could reclaim agency through food. What began as degradation became, over time, a symbol of resilience and culture. Today, chitlins still appear on Southern tables, particularly during holidays, when they're prepared as a ritual of remembrance. Some celebrate them, others avoid them, but their history cannot be ignored. They are proof that enslaved people could take the lowest scraps and, with patience and creativity, turn them into survival and eventually into heritage. Cowpeas. Cowpeas might not enjoy the fame of black-eyed peas, their better-known cousins, but for enslaved people on plantations, they were every bit as important. Hardy, drought-resistant, and easy to grow in poor soil, cowpeas were often cultivated right in the small garden patches enslaved families tended after long days in the fields. They were dependable in a world where little else was, producing steady yields even when the weather turned harsh or rations ran thin. These humble legumes became one of the quiet engines of survival, nourishing bodies with protein, fiber, and the kind of slow-burning energy needed to endure grueling labor. In the pot, cowpeas were as versatile as they were forgiving. They could be boiled plain and eaten with cornmeal bread or stewed with greens, onions, or scraps of pork if such flavorings could be spared. Their earthy taste made them filling, their broth rich and sustaining. The cooking process itself was simple but slow, requiring patience as the peas softened over the fire. A pot of cowpeas could stretch to feed many, turning scarcity into sustenance. Beyond their practicality, cowpeas carried cultural resonance. In West Africa, where these legumes had long been grown and cherished, they were more than just food. They were part of daily life and tradition. Enslaved people, forced across the Atlantic, found in cowpeas a familiar ingredient that connected them to the kitchens and fields of home. Eating them was not just about keeping hunger at bay, it was about remembering. Today, cowpeas are enjoying a kind of quiet renaissance. Farmers celebrate them as heirloom crops, and chefs praise their resilience and flavor. But long before they appeared on trendy menus, cowpeas were the steadfast companions of survival, proof that even the smallest bean can carry the weight of endurance and memory. Cornbread. Cornbread is one of those foods that feels timeless, a dish that has crossed centuries, cultures, and kitchens. For enslaved people on plantations, though, it wasn't the warm, butter-slathered comfort food we imagine today. It was survival. Cornmeal was often the primary ration given out, cheap and easy to produce, and it formed the backbone of countless meals. From it came cornbread, sometimes dense, sometimes crumbly, sometimes barely more than a dry cake meant to quiet hunger. It was not a luxury, but a necessity, a way to stretch meager supplies into something filling enough to carry through the day. The preparation was as simple as the ingredients. Cornmeal mixed with water, perhaps a pinch of salt if available, sometimes a splash of buttermilk or lard when scraps could be spared, baked in cast iron pans if there was access, or in makeshift hearth ovens. Cornbread took many forms. In the best moments, it could be golden and fragrant. In the leanest, it was hard and plain, eaten quickly and without ceremony. Yet even then, it carried the taste of sustenance, of something that would hold body and spirit together for one more day. But cornbread was more than just fuel. It became part of identity. In the slave quarters, it was a food shared by families, broken into pieces and passed around, a symbol of resilience and community. Its roots stretched back to Native American traditions of ground corn, fused with African culinary knowledge, creating a dish that was uniquely born of survival and adaptation. Today, cornbread is celebrated as a Southern classic, served at holiday tables, barbecues, and soul food restaurants. Sweet or savory, skillet or muffin, it carries with it a history far heavier than its crumb. What was once a bare ration is now a beloved staple, proof that endurance can taste like heritage. Turnip greens and roots. Turnips may not strike modern eaters as exciting, but for enslaved people on plantations, both the roots and their leafy tops were lifesavers. Nothing went to waste. The hardy root grew easily in poor soil and provided bulk and calories when other foods were scarce. Meanwhile, the greens, bitter, fibrous, and often dismissed by those who could afford finer fare, were simmered down into tender, nourishing dishes. This dual use made turnips one of the most valuable crops in a survival pantry, stretching every part of the plant into sustenance. Cooking turnip greens was a lesson in patience and transformation. Tough and sharp when raw, the leaves mellowed after long boiling, especially when flavored with a scrap of salt pork or ham bone. The resulting dish was earthy, smoky, and packed with minerals. The roots, on the other hand, could be roasted in ashes, boiled into stews, or mashed into something hearty enough to quiet hunger. Together, greens and roots became a complete meal, filling, nutritious, and adaptable to whatever the day provided. There was also symbolism in the way turnips were used. To take a plant so often dismissed as livestock fodder and turn it into a sustaining dish spoke to the resilience of enslaved families. They found nourishment in what others overlooked, transforming bitterness into strength. Meals of turnip greens and roots became moments of comfort, often shared communally, where food was not just about calories but about connection and endurance. Today, turnip greens still appear on Southern tables, celebrated as soul food alongside collards and mustard greens. The roots, too, are finding a comeback in farm-to-table restaurants that prize rustic simplicity. Yet their story runs deeper than culinary trendiness. For the enslaved, turnips were never fashionable. They were survival, proof that even the humblest crop could hold life together. Pepper vinegar sauce. Pepper vinegar sauce might seem like a small detail in the kitchen, just a condiment sitting quietly on the side. But for enslaved people on plantations, it was more than a dash of flavor. It was a way to transform survival food into something bearable. When rations consisted mostly of cornmeal, greens, or beans day after day, the monotony could be crushing. Pepper vinegar, made by steeping hot peppers in simple vinegar, offered a sharp, fiery kick that brought life back into otherwise plain meals. It wasn't just seasoning, it was spirit in a bottle. The preparation was simple, which was precisely why it endured. A jar of vinegar, a handful of peppers, often grown in small garden patches or foraged, and thyme. The longer it sat, the more potent it became, the tangy vinegar soaking up the pepper's heat until it was both mouth-puckering and tongue-tingling. A few drops on collard greens or a splash over peas turned bland staples into something flavorful, something worth savoring. In this way, pepper vinegar was an act of quiet rebellion, proof that food could hold joy, even when designed only for survival. It also spoke to heritage. Pepper sauces had deep roots in African and Caribbean cooking traditions, where spice was used not just for flavor but for preservation and even medicine. On plantations, carrying forward this knowledge was a way of remembering and reclaiming identity. The fiery sting of peppers cut through the heaviness of life, offering a momentary brightness in meals that otherwise reflected scarcity. Today, pepper vinegar is a Southern classic, often seen in little bottles on the table at barbecue joints or soul food restaurants. Its tang has become tradition, its history woven into every drop. What was once a small act of survival is now a defining taste of the region. Sorghum syrup. Long before refined sugar or maple syrup became everyday staples, sorghum syrup was the sweetener that kept meals from feeling relentlessly plain. For enslaved people on plantations, it was often the only form of sweetness they could count on, drizzled sparingly over cornbread, stirred into porridge, or sipped in tea-like infusions. Thick, dark, and earthy sorghum syrup was more than just flavor. It was energy, quick calories that helped bodies endure the endless labor demanded of them. Sorghum, a tall grain plant originally from Africa, carried with it a lineage of familiarity. Enslaved Africans recognized the crop and its uses, even as they were forced to cultivate it for the benefit of others. Pressing the cane to release its juice and boiling it down into syrup was labor-intensive, but the reward was liquid gold, sweet enough to lift the monotony of otherwise austere diets. A spoonful of sorghum on a cold morning or at the end of a meager meal could feel like a gift, a reminder that even in harshness, small comforts could exist. What made sorghum syrup especially valuable was its accessibility. Unlike imported sugar, which was expensive and tightly controlled, sorghum could be grown locally and processed in small batches. This meant enslaved families sometimes had a rare chance to cultivate or barter for their own supply, turning the syrup into not just food, but a symbol of self-sufficiency. It was, in many ways, the sweetness of resilience. Today, Sorghum syrup survives as a cherished Southern tradition, often compared to molasses but with its own grassy depth. Chefs drizzle it over biscuits or use it in barbecue sauces, while food historians champion it as a link to the past. What once represented a modest joy amid deprivation now stands as a culinary heirloom, proof that sweetness can grow even in bitter soil. Stewed offal, liver, heart, kidneys. When the prized cuts of meat were long gone, what remained were the pieces others dismissed, the organs, the connective tissue, the parts considered unfit for a master's table. For enslaved people on plantations, these leftovers were not waste, they were opportunity. Offal, liver, heart, kidneys was tough, iron-rich, and deeply flavored, and when stewed slowly, it could be transformed into something nourishing enough to sustain both body and spirit. Stewed offal was the epitome of making do with what was given, turning scraps into survival. The preparation demanded patience. Organs had to be cleaned carefully, their strong flavors tempered with onions, peppers, or wild herbs when such things were available. Long, slow cooking over an open fire softened the toughness, letting the meat release richness into the broth. With beans, grains, or a few greens tossed in, the stew became more than just edible. It became hearty, filling, and restorative after long hours of labor. Children might wrinkle their noses, but everyone knew its value. It was protein, iron, and strength in a bowl. Beyond its practical use, stewed offal carried echoes of African food traditions, where nose-to-tail eating was the norm. Nothing was wasted, and every part of the animal had a role in sustaining community. On plantations, this knowledge became a quiet form of survival, a way of honoring skills passed down across generations. Sharing a pot of offal stew in the quarters was not glamorous, but it was communal, a moment to gather and take comfort in resourcefulness. Today, offal's making a comeback, rebranded as nose-to-tail cuisine in trendy restaurants. Dishes that once marked desperation now appear on menus as delicacies, served with wine pairings and artisan bread. Yet behind every bite lies a history of endurance, proof that what was once necessity can, over time, become tradition. Foraged berries. For enslaved people on plantations, foraged berries were more than a seasonal treat. They were tiny bursts of freedom in an otherwise controlled existence. Strawberries, blackberries, mulberries, and wild grapes grew untamed along fence lines, forest edges, and riverbanks, free to anyone who knew where to look. In a life where nearly every aspect of food was rationed, measured, or denied, the act of plucking berries directly from the vine carried its own quiet joy. Sweetness was rare, and to taste it fresh, sun-warmed, and unmediated was to momentarily step outside of deprivation. The berries themselves were versatile. They could be eaten on the spot, a handful shoved into the mouth while working in the fields, or carried back to the quarters to share. Sometimes they were boiled down into thin syrups, stirred into cornmeal mush, or mashed into makeshift preserves when sugar could be found. Even the leaves and roots of certain berry plants were used for teas or folk remedies, blending food and medicine in ways that kept communities alive. But the real value of berries was symbolic as much as nutritional. They represented autonomy, food that wasn't dictated by ration books or overseers. The knowledge of where and when to find them was often passed down parent to child, a quiet education in resilience and resourcefulness. For children, berry picking was both play and provision, a memory of sweetness that lingered even when hunger overshadowed daily life. Today, we romanticize berry picking as a quaint summer pastime, complete with woven baskets and Instagram-worthy photos. Farmers markets celebrate heirloom varieties, and restaurants turn wild berries into artisanal jams. Yet their history runs deeper. For the enslaved, these fruits were not luxury but survival, proof that nature sometimes offered small mercies even in the harshest conditions. Corn pone. Corn pone was the sturdy cousin of cornbread, less fluffy, less adorned, and far more practical. For enslaved people on plantations, it was a reliable companion, a dense cake of cornmeal, water, and salt baked until firm. Unlike the lighter breads that required milk, eggs, or leavening agents, ingredients rarely accessible to the enslaved, corn pone was stripped to its bare essentials. It was food meant to last, to travel, to fill the stomach and silence hunger when rations were meager and days were long. The process was simple but effective. Cornmeal was mixed into a thick batter, shaped by hand into rounds or oblong loaves, and baked against hot coals or in clay ovens. The result was heavy and plain, with a chewy bite and a flavor that leaned on the natural sweetness of corn itself. When eaten warm, it could be comforting. When cold, it became portable, the kind of food that could be slipped into a pocket and carried into the fields. It was sustenance in its purest form. No frills, no indulgence, just survival baked into a loaf. Yet even in its simplicity, corn pone carried meaning. In many ways, it was a testament to resilience, to the ability to transform limited ingredients into something that sustained entire families. Around fires in the slave quarters, pieces of pone would be broken and shared, filling not just bellies but the space of togetherness. The very act of baking it, of shaping it with one's hands, was a small assertion of control in lives otherwise dictated by others. Today, corn pone lingers in the South culinary memory, sometimes confused with cornbread, but cherished in its own right. What was once a food of necessity is now remembered as tradition, a reminder that even the plainest fare can carry the weight of history and endurance. Watermelon. Few foods carry as much cultural baggage as the watermelon, yet long before it became the subject of caricature and stereotype, it was a vital food for enslaved people on plantations. Watermelon thrived in hot southern climates, grew quickly, and produced large, juicy fruits that could quench thirst and provide nourishment during brutal summers. For people forced to labor under the sun, a slice of watermelon was more than a treat. It was hydration, sugar, and refreshment wrapped in a thick green rind. It required no cooking, no rationing, no approval from overseers. It was simply there, growing in the fields and gardens, waiting to be split open. The fruit's abundance made it both practical and symbolic. Watermelon offered a kind of generosity that few other foods did. One melon could be shared among many, its sweet red flesh divided into wedges that brought smiles, if only for a moment. Children could eat it with sticky faces and full bellies, while adults found in its juiciness a rare relief from monotony. Even the seeds were useful, dried and eaten, or saved to plant again, ensuring another crop. The rind, often discarded today, could be pickled and preserved, stretching the life of the fruit beyond its freshness. Nothing went to waste. But watermelon's story is also complicated. Over time, it was twisted into a symbol used to demean and caricature African Americans, stripping away its history as a food of resilience. Yet reclaiming watermelon means recognizing its true role as a fruit of survival, joy, and continuity. Today, watermelon is celebrated at cookouts, picnics, and summer gatherings, its presence central to Southern foodways. For the enslaved, it was not a symbol of stereotype, but of sustenance, proof that sweetness and relief could be found even in the harshest circumstances. Dandelion greens. In today's world, dandelions are usually seen as stubborn weeds invading carefully trimmed lawns. But for enslaved people on plantations, their leaves were a gift from the earth. Dandelion greens were free, abundant, and surprisingly nutritious, offering iron, calcium, and vitamins that were otherwise scarce in meager rations. In a system where food was tightly controlled and hunger was a constant companion, the ability to forage something as common as dandelion leaves meant the difference between weakness and strength. The greens themselves were not exactly tender or mild. Raw, they were bitter, but with boiling or a long simmer in a pot, they softened into something earthy and sustaining. enslaved cooks would often stew them with onions, garlic, or scraps of salt pork if such things were available. Even without embellishment, dandelion greens could be eaten alone or combined with peas or beans to create a hearty, mineral-rich meal. Their bitterness became part of the flavor of survival, strong, sharp, but ultimately sustaining. Beyond their nutritional value, dandelion greens represented knowledge and adaptability. Foraging was a skill carried over from African and indigenous traditions, where wild plants were an essential part of daily foodways. Passing down the knowledge of what could be safely eaten and how to prepare it was not only practical but also cultural, a quiet thread of continuity in a world designed to sever connections. Parents taught children which plants to pick, how to cook them, and in doing so, passed along both survival and memory. Ironically, modern wellness culture now praises dandelion greens as a superfood, sold in health stores and blended into detox smoothies. For the enslaved, there was nothing trendy about them. They were a necessity, a reminder that even the humblest weed could become nourishment when resilience turned scarcity into resource. Rabbit stew. Rabbit stew was one of the ways enslaved people on plantations managed to supplement the meager rations they were given. Rabbits, abundant in the southern landscape, could be trapped with little more than ingenuity and patience. Simple snares made from twine, sticks, or vines. For those who had the skill, hunting and trapping provided a rare source of fresh meat, protein that could transform otherwise plain meals of cornmeal or greens into something hearty and sustaining. A rabbit was small, but in a world where every scrap counted, one animal could stretch into a pot that fed an entire family. The preparation of rabbit stew was as humble as the ingredients available. The rabbit would be cleaned and jointed, then simmered slowly in a pot with water to tenderize the lean meat. Onions, wild herbs, or garden vegetables might be added if they could be found, while a handful of beans, peas, or corn thickened the broth. If fat or salt pork scraps were available, they enriched the flavor, but even without them, the stew delivered warmth, nourishment, and a sense of variety. The aroma of meat simmering was itself a kind of comfort, a reminder of home traditions that had survived the Middle Passage. Rabbit stew also carried cultural echoes. Across West Africa, small game was commonly stewed with vegetables and spices, and enslaved Africans adapted these practices to the New World using whatever resources they could find. The act of sharing a pot of stew, no matter how sparse, became a moment of community, a way to hold on to fragments of identity and dignity. Today, rabbit stew occasionally appears in rustic cookbooks or farm-to-table restaurants, presented as old-fashioned or artisanal. For the enslaved, however, it was not nostalgia or novelty. It was survival simmering slowly in a pot, proof of resilience in every bite. Fish stew with okra. Fish stew with okra was a dish that carried the taste of two worlds, blending African food traditions with the realities of plantation life. Along the rivers, creeks, and coastal regions of the South, enslaved people often relied on fishing to supplement the rations that barely kept them alive. Catfish, perch, or whatever could be pulled from the water found its way into the pot. To make the most of these catches, cooks paired the fish with okra, a vegetable that enslaved Africans had carried across the Atlantic in both memory and seed. Together, they created a stew that was filling, flavorful, and deeply familiar. The stew itself was straightforward but rich with meaning. Fish, often bony or small, was cleaned and simmered gently in water or broth, its flesh flaking into the pot. Okra was added both for substance and for its natural thickening qualities, turning a thin soup into something more substantial. When onions, peppers, or a scrap of pork fat were available, they added depth. But even without them, the pairing of fish and okra created a dish that was sustaining and comforting. The mucilage of the okra, often maligned today, was in this context a blessing, stretching a meal so it could feed more mouths. Beyond nourishment, fish stew with okra resonated with memory. Similar stews had been made for centuries in West Africa, where seafood and okra were central to daily cooking. Recreating these flavors under the brutal conditions of slavery was a way of preserving cultural identity, of refusing to let the past be erased entirely. Around a fire, sharing bowls of stew, enslaved families kept alive connections to the lands and kitchens they had been torn from. Today, echoes of this dish live on in Southern gumbo and West African okra soups, showing how survival foods became cornerstones of culinary tradition. Cabbage and salt pork. Cabbage and salt pork was a dish born of scarcity, but it managed to deliver both nourishment and comfort. Cabbage, cheap and easy to grow, thrived in the South soil and was one of the few vegetables that could be counted on to last through colder months. For enslaved people on plantations, it was a reliable green that could bulk out meals when little else was available. Salt pork, on the other hand, was rarely a generous cut. Often it was scraps, fatback, or rind, but even these fragments carried the prized flavor of meat. When simmered together, the richness of the pork infused the cabbage, turning a plain vegetable into something smoky, salty, and deeply satisfying. Cooking it was simple. Chopped cabbage leaves were boiled down with bits of salt pork, sometimes with onions, turnips, or other vegetables thrown in when possible. The broth that developed was just as valuable as the solids, sopped up with cornbread or drunk straight from the bowl. In an environment where rations were meager, this humble pot became a dependable source of sustenance, stretching scraps into a meal hearty enough to feed many. But beyond calories, cabbage and salt pork carried a quiet sense of resilience. Families gathered around these pots not just to eat, but to find comfort, to share something warm in lives that were otherwise cold and demanding. Today, you'll still see versions of this pairing on Southern tables, a reminder that dishes born from survival can endure as symbols of tradition and strength. Corn husk tea/herbal infusions. In a world where coffee and store-bought tea were luxuries far out of reach, enslaved people on plantations turned to the land itself for warmth in a cup. Corn husk tea was one of the simplest and most resourceful answers to that need. Instead of tossing away the dry, papery husks stripped from corn, they were rinsed, dried, and steeped in boiling water. The result was a mild, slightly sweet infusion that offered comfort and hydration. A far cry from the bitter sting of coffee, but still a moment of reprieve in long, exhausting days. Herbal infusions stretched far beyond corn husks. Knowledge of plants carried from Africa and learned anew from indigenous people in the Americas gave enslaved families a toolkit for both survival and healing. Sassafras root, mint, dandelion, and wild herbs all found their way into makeshift teas. Some were brewed for flavor, others for medicinal purposes, soothing stomachs, calming fevers, or offering a sense of relief when professional medical care was withheld. Every cup was a quiet act of resilience, drawing on tradition and the natural world to meet needs that the system of slavery ignored. These teas were never just about thirst. They carried memory, resourcefulness, and connection. Around the fire at night, sipping a warm infusion meant more than drinking. It meant holding onto fragments of culture and care. Today, when herbal teas are sold as health tonics and trendy detoxes, it's worth remembering their roots as survival drinks, brewed from scraps and knowledge in the harshest of conditions. Pumpkin and squash dishes. Pumpkins and squash were more than seasonal decorations for enslaved people on plantations. They were dependable staples that provided bulk, nourishment, and variety when diets were otherwise monotonous. These vegetables grew well in southern soil, stored for months without spoiling, and could be prepared in countless ways. Their versatility made them essential, roasted whole in hot ashes, boiled into soups, mashed into stews, or even baked into simple breads when combined with cornmeal. Every part was used, from the sweet orange flesh to the seeds, which could be roasted for an extra bit of protein and fat. For families with so little control over their food, pumpkins and squash offered the rare comfort of abundance. A single gourd could stretch across several meals, feeding children and adults alike. The natural sweetness of pumpkin was especially prized, a reminder that flavor could exist even in hardship. For children, the soft texture made it one of the first foods they ate, while for adults, it was filling fuel for long days in the fields. These dishes also carried memory and continuity. African food traditions often used gourds and similar vegetables, so cooking pumpkin or squash became a way of adapting old practices to new landscapes. Around the fire, a pot of squash stew or roasted slices of pumpkin meant more than just food. It meant endurance and connection to the land. Today, pumpkin pie and roasted squash are holiday favorites, but their deeper story is one of resilience, where humble gourds once stood between hunger and survival. Pickled vegetables. For enslaved people on plantations, pickled vegetables were not a luxury but a strategy for survival. Fresh produce was seasonal and rations were sparse, so preserving food for lean months was essential. Pickling, using little more than salt, vinegar, and thyme, transformed cucumbers, okra, peppers, and even scraps of roots into jars of sustenance that could last well beyond harvest. These tangy, briny vegetables added variety to meals that were often plain and repetitive, providing not just flavor, but crucial nutrients during the long stretches when fresh greens weren't available. The process was practical and communal. Vegetables from small garden patches or foraged from the land were packed tightly into jars or crocks, covered with vinegar brine and left to ferment. Over weeks, the sharpness developed, and what might have spoiled became preserved. For families facing constant uncertainty about their next meal, pickling was a quiet form of security, a way of pushing back against scarcity with foresight and skill. Beyond their utility, pickled vegetables carried cultural weight. Preserving food through fermentation was a technique familiar across Africa and carried into the Americas, adapted to new crops and environments. Each jar held more than food. It held memory, knowledge, and a small sense of control in lives defined by deprivation. Today, pickled vegetables are celebrated as artisanal delicacies, praised for their tang and probiotic benefits. Yet behind every trendy pickle jar is a long history of necessity, where sharp flavors once softened the bitterness of survival and helped keep hunger at bay. Wild honey. Wild honey was one of the rarest and most treasured finds for enslaved people on plantations. Unlike cornmeal or salt pork, it was not part of the ration diet, nor was it something that could be cultivated in neat rows. Honey had to be discovered, sought out in hollow trees or wild hives, sometimes at the risk of painful stings. But when it was found, it was precious, thick, golden, and sweet. Wild honey was a gift from the land, a taste of indulgence in a life designed to strip away joy. The value of honey was both practical and emotional. Practically, it was one of the few natural sweeteners available, packed with energy that could be stirred into porridge, drizzled over cornbread, or eaten straight from the comb. Its antibacterial properties also made it useful in folk remedies, applied to wounds or mixed into teas to soothe sore throats and coughs. Emotionally, honey carried an almost magical quality. For children, it was a delight, a sticky treat that felt like abundance. For adults, it was a reminder that nature could still provide moments of beauty, even in the midst of cruelty. Honey also connected enslaved people to traditions carried from Africa, where bees and honey had long been part of foodways, medicine, and even spiritual practice. Finding honey in the American landscape was not just sustenance, but continuity, a way of reclaiming something familiar in unfamiliar soil. Today, honey enjoys a global reputation as a natural superfood, sold in glass jars with artisanal labels. Yet for the enslaved, wild honey was not luxury or trend. It was a rare mercy, found in the woods and shared sparingly. Every golden drop carried the sweetness of survival, proof that even in bitter circumstances, life could still offer something sweet. And that's our journey through 30 survival foods of enslaved people, meals born from hardship, ingenuity, and resilience. These dishes weren't just food, they were survival, memory, and the roots of so much of what we call Southern and soul food today. If you learned something new or felt a connection to these stories, go ahead and give this video a like, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more history served at the table.